I mean, we won't probably talk about for now, at least we won't talk about the partisan movement. But yeah, it was very big and quite well organized. So, especially in this constellation of forces, I mean, these collaborations really didn't have a chance. I mean, the partisan movement even had, besides being a very mass movement, maybe the largest or the second largest in Europe, they also had people inside of the collaborationist and Chetniks forces who worked for them. Even I think they even had their own guy in the special police, like the anti-communist police, like the partisans had a person there giving them information. And I, like, from my own like personal history, like when I was a kid, I like used to spend a lot of time with my grandmother, and she used to talk to me stuff from her life. And she came from a communist family. Her uncle was like a member of the Communist Party since 1924 and was a partisan and killed by the Nazis. And she herself was active in that way, but officially she was like active in the Red Cross during the occupation, and she lived in Serbia during the occupation. And she, as a Red Cross member, she was able to travel around Serbia. And also the Red Cross headquarters in the town that she lived was also a secret headquarters of the Communist Party and therefore the resistance. So she was given different tasks as to do. And at one point she told me she had to travel to Belgrade to deliver some message to some flat, which was one of these like safe houses for the resistance, really. And when she got there, I mean, of course, she was very nervous doing this. And, this is like Nedić, Belgrade. There's people all over the place. And she's going into the building where she's supposed to deliver this message and going up the stairs. And suddenly one of these Nedić, like the Serbian State Guard people, is like in uniform, is like going towards her down the stairs. And she's like totally freaked out. She's thinking, okay, I'm dead. This is the trap. And then the guy just kindly says, oh, hello, smiles and just pass through like next to her and outside of the building. And then she realized, oh, this is one of our guys, like who's infiltrated the Nedić formation, and so
wow. yeah.
Fantastic. Ray's grandma, total badass. All right, welcome back to The Empire Never Ended. We got some Boris, got a little bit of Fritz, got a bit of Ray there mixed in.
Hey.
You put them together, you got some Serbian collaborationism.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about today? I gotta refresh my memory here.
I hope so.
We're talking about the so-called Nedić regime or the Serbian collaborationist regime during the Second World War. I mean, we kind of set it up with a few episodes now already, so I hope it will be a bit easier to understand everything, but I'll kind of review some of the things that were already said before.
It's probably wise.
Yeah.
Never a bad idea.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of stuff was going on in those days.
Not a lot of good stuff.
No.
A lot of interesting stuff.
No. So, okay, so the war started, the Second World War started, and as we know, Yugoslavia got involved. We already mentioned that by its government signing the pact with Axis powers, which was not very popular. So this was signed on the 25th of March of 1941. And on the 27th of March, so 2 days later, there were already mass demonstrations, anti-fascist ones, against the Yugoslavia joining the Axis powers, basically, in some kind of way. So these mass demonstrations happened, and as we already said, as a result of that, or simultaneously with that, a coup d'etat happened, and there was a change of power directly as a result of that. This really pissed off Adolf Hitler, who immediately on the same day enacted something which was called the Fuhrer Directive number 25.
Good name, catchy.
Yeah, which basically...
It's like Strawberry Letter 23 or whatever it's called.
Yeah, so this meant that basically, Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia is imminent. And it happened it started on the 6th of April. So there was a short war called the April War, which was, before the end of the April, it was already finished. And this was the end of, the monarchist Yugoslavia, basically. Pretty much the Yugoslav army was crushed.
Yeah.
And Nazis invaded Yugoslavia and really dismembered it. So today we'll talk about what was going on in the Serbian part, where a collaborationist government was imposed. But just like to give you an idea what happened in the rest of the Yugoslavia. So as we already covered, we didn't cover actually the Ustaša regime during the Second World War, right? We only,
not yet.
Yeah, we only said how it was prepared and everything was in place for the invasion. But as soon as the invasion happened, Nazis basically handed the Ustašas with their own state, which was a pretty huge state called the Independent State of Croatia, which was consisted out of not only Croatia, but also the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina and parts of Serbia and so on. Also, Italy annected and occupied parts of Slovenia and Dalmatia, and in fact, large parts of what was the so-called independent state of Croatia was also controlled by Italy. Italy also controlled Montenegro, as we talked about in the last episode. Mm-hmm. And also Kosovo and parts of Macedonia. Germany annected and occupied parts, the greatest part of Slovenia. So that was the only part of Yugoslavia that was really became a part of the Reich itself.
Yeah.
Bulgaria occupied most of Macedonia and also parts of southeast Serbia. Mm-hmm. Hungary occupied the Bačka region of Vojvodina and also part of Slovenia. So even parts of Serbia and Belgrade were now became parts of the Ustaša state. And so what was left really as Serbia was a rather small territory that was similar to what Serbia was before the start of the Balkan Wars in the early 20th century, with the addition of this region called Banat, mm-hmm. Which was before Yugoslavia was formed a part of Austro-Hungary. And now formally it is part of this occupied Serbia. But what is specific about Banat is that it has this time has a large local German population. Mm-hmm. And so this makes it a very specific region. Although it is a part of the occupied Serbia, it is really the control in it is handed to the local Germans, mm-hmm. Who have their own Nazi organization there. And in fact, they were quite, some of their leaders, like local Nazi leaders, were very ambitious, and what they wanted for the Third Reich is to basically give them a mini Nazi state there.
Okay.
That would be directly connected with the Reich. But this is not like Hitler was not so much into this. So officially it was a part of Serbia, but basically they had their own kind of mini state there because the local Germans were in full control, and their leader called Sepp Janko, who is like a local German an enthusiastic Nazi, and like a local mini Quisling there who survived the war and died in Argentina in 2001, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
One of those guys.
Yeah. So the rest, so this whole territory of Serbia it has some like 3,800,000 people living there. 80% of them are Serbs. The situation is pretty chaotic immediately after the occupation. Also, I mean, the whole war was, in a way, from Hitler's perspective, an attempt to punish the Serbs, who were seen as the main force behind the anti-Axis demonstrations and coup d'etat. So Serbia was really in a bad position there. There was two different collaborationist governments successively established. One was very short term, and it existed only for a few months in 1941. It was established on the 30th of April, and it lasted until the 29th of August of that year. And the head of this first collaborationist government was a guy called Milan Nedić. So he naturally was a cop. Not only that, but he was also the minister of in police in the Stojadinović government in the 30s. So something I also want to mention is that we covered already some of these Serbian fascists before. So we covered Ljotić and his organization and Stojadinović and his party in episode 24, so maybe that it's a good idea to listen to that again, because a lot of these collaborationist governments officials consist out of these two factions of Serbian fascism. One faction are the followers of Dimtrije Ljotić and his small movement called Zbor, which was always in opposition in Yugoslavia, receiving like about 1% of votes in the elections, but was very enthusiastically fascist. And Ljotić, the leader, had this idea that he created a specific Yugoslav and Serbian kind of fascism. He didn't call it fascism, but that's what it was. And he was also supportive of an alliance with Axis powers.
Right.
The other faction were the followers of Milan Stojadinović, who was a kind of an opportunist politician, much more capable than Ljotić, who was actually a prime minister, and before that he was minister of finance and had his roots in the Radical Party, and then he formed his own faction of the Radical Party, which was very pro-Axis, and started adopting some of the Nazi policies and also aesthetics, really.
They wore funny uniforms.
Such things. Stojadinović himself was not in Yugoslavia when the war started, because it was a very turbulent time in Yugoslavia. So the government that came after him thought that he's too pro-Axis, and they basically exiled him from Yugoslavia. And then the Brits interned him on the Mauritius, I think. So for the rest of the war, he was interned there.
Interesting.
And so he didn't have the opportunity to be a collaborator himself, but a lot of his guys were in Serbia. And so the first head of the collaborationist government, Milan Nedić, is very much a Stojadinović person, a member of his party, and as I said, was a minister of the police in Stojadinović's government. He, in addition to being like a member of this right-wing pro-fascist party and a cop, was also quite anti-communist and pro-Nazi himself. And he had contacts with Nazis in the 30s already. So, for example, in 1937, him and this other anti-communist pro-Nazi cop called Dragi Jovanović were in Berlin, and they met Heinrich Himmler and Heydrich and made some agreements with them, probably about some police work against the communists, but who knows, whatever. So he really had close connections with high-up Nazis. So the first government was usually referred to as the Commissar regime or something like this, because the Commissar was the word that was used for the positions that were analogous to ministers in a normal government. And it was pretty weak government in a very chaotic situation. But enthusiastically pro-Nazi. So one of the things that they immediately started doing was enacting a Serbian version of the Nuremberg racial laws that basically put Jews and Roma people outside of any kind of rights, including the right to have a job and so on. And immediately, like in April, one of the priorities was that they were started to register Jews and Roma, and immediately there were like atrocities committed against them. But it really started in August of that year in a much more brutal way. Also, one of his first duties as this collaborationist head of puppet government was to reconstruct the data, the files of the members of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. So it's interesting because it needed to be reconstructed, because in this short period when the Stojadinović government was not in place, and there were people in the Yugoslav government who were anti-Axis oriented, there was a minister of police called, I think, Serbian Bulisavljević, who ordered for all of these files of members of the Communist Party to be destroyed, which is very interesting, because they figured out, okay, Nazi invasion is imminent. Nazis will use this against, communists. And even this guy was like by no means a communist or anything like that. He just did that, which is I was kind of surprised to find that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
So, so now the head of the government is basically the guy who made all of those files who were destroyed. So he's able to reconstruct them in some way. Mm-hmm. Of course, if they were not destroyed, I think there will be much more. It will be much more easy for Nazis to really attack the new resistance movement, which was led by the Communist Party. So it is also, I mean, it is important to say, I didn't say this, that, so Serbia officially doesn't exist. It's an occupied territory, and it is, they call it Serbia, but what it is, it's like the territory of the military commander, of the German military commander. And this is the person who's really in charge. So, Serbia is allowed to have this administration, but it's not recognized as an ally state to the Third Reich, even though enthusiastic pro-Nazi people are in charge.
Right. So very much unlike the situation in Croatia, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, for example, they are not allowed to have full diplomatic relations with Axis powers and such things. So this was the stuff that the government was doing, but they were under permanent surveillance of the guy called Harald Turner, who was the head of he was an officer, of course, because it was a military regime, a German officer, but he was the head of the administration, the German administration there. So he's very much the main person there. And then the Serbian collaborationists work for him. So the immediate task of the first collaborationist government was to, enable the continuity of government as much as they could, specifically bureaucracy, and to purge bureaucracy from anti-fascists and other people who were not seen in a positive light by the Nazis. And this is what they did, and a lot of bureaucrats really stayed, local especially, kind of continued their jobs, at least at first. And this especially is true for cops. So, the head of a government is a cop, but also basically what the Serbs have as a kind of armed force at the time is the gendarmerie, the kind of more militarist side of the police, which mostly sided with the collaborationists.
Who would say that cops would collaborate with the fascists?
Yeah, really. I think the Serbian State Guard was essentially made up of gendarmerie.
I will get to that.
Okay, sorry.
So at first you only have gendarmerie, which, as I said, is this kind of more kind of military style, but basically cops. So what happens early on is that there is a mass resistance led by the Communist Party, which starts officially on the 7th of July in 1941. There is also a royalist resistance, usually referred to as Chetniks, who call themselves the Yugoslav army in fatherland, who are led by this royalist general called Draža Mihailović, who in 1941 really started as a kind of anti-occupation movement. But then later on started to collaborate more with the occupiers and to really focus on fighting against the partisans, the communist resistance. But are seen also as especially the beginning, as a resistance movement. So it's a pretty chaotic situation.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to control it. So the Nazis are really pissed off that there are attacks on them, the sabotage is going on, and so on. So they really decide to push the hard line of repression. So they officially declared that there will be reprisals for all attacks, and for every killed German soldier, 100 of locals would be shot, and for every wounded one, 50 would be shot. And they start doing that. So early on, you have mass shootings of people, taking hostages and so on. So in Kraljevo, over 2,000 people are taken hostage and shot, and so on. And the local collaborationists assist in all of this. So right. They're usually reluctant to really shoot the people who are taking hostage themselves, but they're taking people hostage and assisting Nazis in doing all of this. And they especially assist by providing lists of people who should be arrested. So Nazis declare, okay, we will arrest this many people because 2 soldiers were shot, and then the Serbian collaborators provide a list of people who should be arrested. And a lot of people who were actually, often today people, especially nationalists, would say how, this rule was that for every German soldier, 100 Serbs will be shot and so on. Actually, it wasn't only Serbs, especially in the beginning, it was mostly Jews, yes. Roma, and communists and so on.
That's actually, that's how the Roma started to become executed in these camps, was because, frankly, they ran out of Jews to murder in these reprisals. Exactly. And I think Belgrade am I wrong? In Serbia was the first city declared Judenfrei or something. In
the first capital.
The first capital city. Okay.
Yeah. That's all true.
And that's when they started to really include the Roma in this really aggressive way as well. Yeah.
Yeah. This is all going on. Of course, the collaborationists also participate in arresting Jews. But the Germans are really not satisfied with this first government, so they replace it in August of 41 with a new government of Milan Nedić, which is usually, they referred it to as the government of national salvation or something like this. Mm-hmm. So Milan Nedić is the main really character in this story today. He is the Serbian collaborationist. A figure sometimes compared to Pétain in France. They're similar in they were both high-ranking officers in the army and had a role in the First World War.
Yeah, decorated war heroes.
Yeah, seen as war heroes and so on. So Nedić was born in 1877. He died in 1946. Maybe I'm spoiling now the end of the story. He, yes, as we said, he was seen as a hero of the First World War, and it was kind of an army officer close to politics in some sense. In the 30s, he was already the chief of staff of the Yugoslav army, and he was also a government minister. He was the minister of the army and the navy in the 30s. He was known to be very pro-Axis oriented and to be very close to his close relative Dimtrije Ljotić, the leader of the fascist party Zbor, and was kind of counted as his man there. Which was not always seen as in a good light. Even when there were pro-Axis, pro-fascist politicians in government, they really didn't like Ljotić that much. In the preparation for the war in the late 1930s and early 1940, before the occupation, Nedić had this really defeatist position, and he said Yugoslavia has no chance in a war against Germany, and basically we should, align with them. And he had this plan, this memorandum that he gave to the government, which was very much in tune with what Ljotić was saying at the time. So he was forced to go to the pension early, I think in 1940 or something, 1939. I'm not sure exactly. But then when Yugoslavia was attacked, he was again activated in the army
for one last job.
Yeah, but he did a really poor job. He was a commander of like a important part of the Yugoslav army, but basically he didn't do almost anything. And later, the exiled royalist government would blame him for the defeat of the army against the German invasion. So he supposedly at first is reluctant to take this position of the head collaborator, but then he agrees. So
I couldn't. No.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. I mean, he does seem like kind of a depressive figure, you know, like he doesn't seem enthusiastic about anything, and kind of.
Okay, he's just lethargic.
Yeah.
Just drags his feet through fascism.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons of supposedly why he agreed to do it, because he heard that the Chetniks of Kosta Pećanac are aligned with Germans and a part of this new regime. So about Chetniks. So we talked before about Chetniks. It's maybe a bit confusing who Chetniks are because they have a long history and so on. So we said that they started, you know, in the early 20th century as a kind of Serbian paramilitary to fight against the Ottomans in the part of Balkans that were still controlled by the Turks. And in the 20s and 30s, they became a kind of nationalist paramilitary in Yugoslavia with very pro-fascist kind of side to it and so on. Usually when we talk about the Second World War, the word Chetniks is reserved for the guys that I mentioned previously, the fighters of Draža Mihailović, who officially call themselves, as I said, the Yugoslav army. Mm-hmm. But there are also other like factions who call themselves Chetniks, and maybe even have a better like more right claim to call themselves that a better claim. Yes. So one of these people is Kosta Pećanac and his troops, and he's a real Chetnik because he was a part of this whole history since the early 20th century until the end of the Second World War of Chetniks. You know, he was a Chetnik leader, you know, from Serbia who fought in Macedonia in 1906 and was, you know, beating up striking workers in Belgrade as a Chetnik, and then was a leader in the 20s or 30s of one of the big Chetnik associations, and also aligned with the proto-fascist movements that existed in Yugoslavia and so on. And now he has his own band of Chetniks and is a collaborator. But it is interesting that he supposedly already made some kind of a deal with Nazis before the invasion and met them in 41 in February in Sofia, Bulgaria, and received funds for them, like 200,000 of marks. And it's interesting the role that he had early on after the invasion is he set up his Chetnik headquarters somewhere in rural Serbia, and basically started appointing this voivode, the Chetnik, I don't know, dukes, you can call them. Yeah. This is the term they use for their leaders. And it seemed to many that what he is doing is starting a resistance movement, you know, mm-hmm. because he's basically starting a guerrilla operation and is, you know, asking people to join him. And many people join him on this, because of this idea that they're joining a resistance movement. And what it turns out that, no, he is becoming a part of the collaborationist regime. Yeah. And his goal is to fight against the communist partisans. But some of these people who joined him early on are attacking Germans and collaborating with partisans. Right. So they are quickly arrested, sentenced to death and so on. So many desert. Some joined the Chetniks of, a lot of them actually joined the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović, who by that point are still, the resistance, mm-hmm. like the royalist resistance, together with the communist one, and are collaborating with the communist resistance at that point. So Nedić is encouraged that this guy is also on their side, so he agrees to be the head of the government. By the way, these Chetniks of Kosta Pećanac at the time were usually called black Chetniks or legal Chetniks, to differentiate them from the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović, who were illegal Chetniks.
Illegal Chetniks.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and black Chetniks I mentioned because they wore a black uniform or something like this. I'm not sure. So he claimed that he had like 15,000 Chetniks. It's probably not that much, but just yeah. So immediately, so the Nedić government was formed in the end of August, and they had their first like government session in the beginning of September. And one of the things they immediately did was they started a new collaborationist armed force. This was started on the 15th of September in 41, and it was called the Serbian Volunteer Corps. That's what they wanted to call themselves, but the Germans allowed them to call themselves Serbian Volunteer Command, and only in the 43 they were allowed to actually call themselves Serbian Volunteer Corps. So what they was basically a Ljotić party army. So Zbor, the fascist party of Ljotić, they had their like youth wing, which was called White Eagles, and out of them this unit was formed initially. Later, some people were mobilized, but they were not the biggest of the collaborationist forces.
Did Ljotić finally let them like wear cool uniforms and Sieg Heil and stuff like that?
No, I mean,
still,
there are no like photos of them Sieg Heiling and so on. And they, as many of these collaborationist forces in Serbia, they usually wore the uniform of the Yugoslav army. But as the time passed, they were getting some German and Italian equipment, including the uniforms. I mean, from the start they got the weapons, but then later also uniforms and such things. So in 41 they had like less than 3,000 fighters. In 42 it was like less than 4,000, and in 43 it grew from 4,000 to 6,000. And in the end of the war they supposedly had almost like 10,000 people. We'll talk about this. This is also because a lot of Chetniks joined them at the time, and other collaborationists and so on. But they were the most enthusiastic of the collaborationist forces because they were very motivated. They were ideologically fascist and anti-communist, and they were seen as a kind of a elite of the Serbian collaborationist forces. It's interesting because even though they were the most enthusiastic and collaborationists, they also kind of they, for example, refused to send some of their guys to the Eastern Front to fight there, which is something that Nazis really pressured them to do. But they didn't want to do it because they were really hated enough by that time in Serbia as kind of seeing the worst collaborationists, and probably that would be a very unpopular move to do. They also, for example, still were very much royalist, and they considered the young king who was exiled in England to be their head of government, and they swore oaths of loyalty to him and so on, although he considered them traitors and so on. And they carried like a little they had a little pin that had the emblem on it, which was this kind of cross, like a metal pin, which is a cross that had like St. George killing the dragon. The dragon was, of course, communism, but it also had a slogan, for the king and country or something like this.
And the king's just like, I don't know these guys.
Yeah.
That's so very sad.
They were like, the king is, young and he's manipulated by the British or something like this. That's them. And so mostly, by the way, Zbor, the party, was also officially, because all parties and movements were banned after the occupation, but Zbor was pretty quickly allowed to reorganize. So it existed also as a civilian organization. Mostly, as I said, the fighters, the soldiers of this formation, which usually were called volunteers or Ljotićevci, which means, followers of Ljotić, consisted out of these young members of Zbor. But officers were usually actual ex-officers of the Yugoslav army or gendarmerie, including the main guy, their leader, the commander called Kosta Pećanac, who was an army officer before. In 41 they consisted out of 12 detachments. Each had 120, 150 soldiers, and then they grew over time a little bit. They also were heavy on ideology, unlike some of these other formations. So they had an educational section, and they had this. They had this institution that was basically their version of a commissar, like the partisans did. So every of their units had basically a fascist commissar in it who was, taking care of morale and ideology and everything. And they had also an intelligence unit where a guy called Branko Gašparević worked. We'll talk about in the next episode. An interesting character. Still, although Nedić founded this, he was not allowed to have any really command over it. The real command was in the force of in the hands of the German army, like military commander.
I guess that's why you call it a puppet state.
Yeah, and this was this was something that Nedić for years tried to get, like a real command over these forces. He did get it in 1943, finally, after meeting Hitler. But also it's dubious how much actually, because of course the Nazis would never completely, give up power on something like that, especially in 1943.
Because in 1943 they only had a year left in Serbia. They didn't know that at the time, but a year later they'd be pushed out completely. Also, all of their units have a German liaison officer in them, so they're really integrated with the Waffen SS and Wehrmacht practically completely. So that's them. They enthusiastically are used to fight against the communists, but also to do the dirty work, to arrest people, to take hostages, to assist Germans in these reprisals, and are very much a part of the Holocaust in Serbia that happened there. And so I mean, a vast majority of Belgrade's Jews were killed in the camp, in the Starosamište camp. So they weren't even deported to the major Nazi death camps in the rest of Europe. In fact, the Germans they pioneered some methods here, which is the mobile gas chamber, which was basically a truck with the exhaust fed back into the truck, and they'd drive around and gas.
They'd drive to a mountain, I think, and drop them off at the base, as I understand.
Yes.
Head back.
I want to talk about all of that.
Okay. But, sorry, Ray.
No, it's fine.
Just preparing the audience. Shit gets bad.
I mean, not in great detail, but I will mention it. So that's the volunteers or Ljotić followers or the Serbian Volunteer Corps. There was another major unit there, in addition to the legal Chetniks and these people, which was called the Serbian State Guard, which was formed after this volunteer corps was formed. By Nedić as well, and they were formed out of as Fritz said earlier, out of the gendarmerie detachments or basically the police detachments. So they were formed in February of 1942, and they were much bigger than the volunteers. So they were there was almost 20,000 of them, or maybe even 20,000 of them. But they were mostly used as a kind of a stationary force. So they were stationed in 5 different regions of occupied Serbia, and sometimes they were used. I mean, they were used to attack communists for reprisals. Basically, the same as these volunteers, assisting in everything the Nazis did, but were not so mobile and enthusiastic about fighting. Especially, were not into so much in fighting against the illegal Chetnik. Unlike Ljotić's followers, the volunteers, who were also very much anti-Chetnik. If you talk about these illegal Chetniks at the time, so they were the Serbian Volunteer Corps was not only used to fight against the communist partisans, but also against the Chetniks, and there were a lot of killing between them and Chetniks. On the other hand, the Serbian State Guard officially had to be against the Chetniks, but they throughout the war had connections with them, supplied them with material, so they would occasionally be arrested by the Germans because of this and so on. Sometimes they would even sometimes they would even stage fake fights with Chetniks, and then Chetniks would disarm them and take their arms. So this is also how they would supply stuff to Chetniks.
Interesting.
But they were, as I said, they were not really trusted that much. So the Ljotić guys were trusted much more because they were enthusiastically also against Chetniks and against Western allies and against everyone.
Right.
but sometimes they were also not trusted because they, on the other hand, also didn't want to go to the Eastern Front. So some of them, even some of the Ljotić guys, even at some times were arrested by Nazis and so on. Because as we'll talk about in the next episode, they're even more enthusiastic Nazi collaborators than them who are like actual Nazis. Not a lot of them, but they exist. And sometimes they plotted their little plots even against some of the Ljotić guys as not being enthusiastically enough pro-Nazi and so on.
Fascist, but not Nazi.
Yeah. Okay. I will have to do this page turning a few times.
No, that's all right. Sometimes
you can see Ray's dedication.
Yeah. Sometimes I like hearing a little paper in the mix. It shows that you're literate.
Yeah. So, of course, I think before we mentioned that in Yugoslavia there was this thing called special police, which was the anti-communist police. They, of course, enthusiastically became Nazi collaborators, the whole organization basically. So a few hundred of their agents are now also a separate collaborationist thing. And they even start a special section, which is called the 7th section, which is used against Jews and Roma specifically. So it's a kind of racist Nazi section of this already Nazi police. So you see how enthusiastically they are a part of the everything that's going on. And usually the one of the first things all of these forces do is this, racial laws, arresting Jews, communists, and so on. Of course, this is also in part they are very anti-Semitic, of course, but the anti-Semitism makes them see, the communist resistance as being led by the Jews.
Yeah. Right.
So they think, if you arrest all the Jews, we'll basically arrest the communist leadership, which is, of course, totally not true, as they will see.
They never really learned that one, did they? Never. No. Even today.
No.
Never figured that one out.
But they enthusiastically do it. So the Jewish community in Yugoslavia, in Serbia, was not that big. There was approximately 16,700 Jews living in occupied Serbia, but almost all of them, like 90% of these people, were killed very quickly. So more than 15,000 people, Jews in Serbia, were killed. In addition to that, I think 80,000 people were killed in concentration camps in Serbia. So this was also Serbs and Roma and other people. So a system of concentration camps is established. One of them is Logor Banjica, or the Banjica camp, established in the Belgrade suburb of Banjica in June of 41. And it is run in a dual way. It is run by Gestapo, but also by the Serbian Special Police. And the people who guard it are all of these forces that we mentioned: the State Guard, the Serbian Volunteer Corps, and so on. So at least 23,000 people went through this camp. Jews, Roma, at first mostly. But as they pretty quickly killed all the Jews or sent them to other concentration camps in Europe, they focused more on all the enemies of the Nedić regime they could find. And as you said...
Which were quite a few. It was not a popular regime by any means,
Yes. And this happened in 42 when, as you said, Belgrade and Serbia were declared to be Judenfrei, or free of Jews, and they considered one of the military commanders said Nedić will have, his place in history as a person who basically solved the Jewish question in Serbia.
On the Roma front too, that question was at that time also said to have been solved through a mix of executions and also like legal redefinitions. And many Roma were, I think, bureaucratically sort of converted into being legally Serbs, and the ones that couldn't, which were mostly those the non-stationary, more nomadic, uprooted sorts, those were the ones that the Nazis focused most heavily on.
I was actually just reading a story recently about one of the oldest Roma settlements in Belgrade, and there's some strange account of them being sent to Banjica concentration camp.
Yes.
And then petitioning a cop to have Nedić release them. And I guess some of them were released, but I think they were legally redefined as Serbs or whatever.
Well, there was also a group of more, we'll say like middle class type Roma living in the center that petitioned the occupation government to consider them Aryan racially.
They're the only ones that can really say
the closest possible.
A literal Indo-Aryan language. I mean,
well, that's what they said. They're like, if anybody's Aryan here, it's us, right? Yeah. So a lot of and also, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know if this is true or not. Is the Banjica camp? This was more of like a political camp, right? And not so much. It wasn't for racial extermination. It was for partisans mostly. Yeah.
Well, I think I kind of tried to say that from what I read now. In the beginning, it was more focused on Jews and Roma people, but especially as Jews were exterminated very early on, then it focused more on political enemies of Nedić, which was a lot of people.
Oh, what might be good to mention also, sorry, it's just that I don't know if it matters or we'll keep it in, but Roma people were also very active in the partisan movement and in and around Belgrade and in Serbia. So it's not simply a story of mass victimization, which it obviously also is, but there was also a large inclusion of fighters and
yes.
People in the mix.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's interesting, the partisan movement in Yugoslavia, it didn't include only, all of the usual Yugoslav peoples that you think about, Serbs, Croats, and so on. It included basically everyone, like a lot of Roma fighters, a lot of Jewish fighters, a lot of German fighters. They were like local Germans, and there was even a special like German partisan detachment in Yugoslavia. So it's very diverse. So there was there was quite a few of these camps, concentration camps, but another very important one is usually called Sajmište. Officially, it was called the Jewish camp Zemun. So it is in Zemun or near Zemun. I mean, actually, it's called Zemun. It's what is today New Belgrade. But officially, this territory is a part of the independent state of Croatia, but it is somehow attached to the occupying system in Serbia. So the independent state of Croatia agreed to give this territory to the military commander of Serbia, but only if Serbs, Quisling troops are not used in it. So it is run by the SS, and it's basically a center for Holocaust in Serbia, and this is where they enforce these new ways of killing people that Boris mentioned, like this like gas wagon, the trucks that all the gases go into the hermetically sealed back of the truck, where they can fit 50 people inside, and while they drive them to their already dug up graves, they basically kill them in the process by just driving the truck. And this is how they killed a lot of Jewish people in Serbia. Quite. I mean, not only Jewish people, but mostly Jewish people were killed in such a way, especially in the beginning of the war. But of course, so now this camp is run by the SS, but the prisoners are quite often supplied by the Serbian collaborationist forces. Not only them, but at least in most of the cases, they all assist in that. Not always by arresting people, but by giving all of these lists of communist Jews and so on, and other potential enemies of the system to the Nazis. I mean, in that way, they are essential because they are local people, and many of them are cops. And they just continue to do what they did before. So I think 8,000 Jews were killed in this camp, but also I think 30,000 other prisoners as well as the war went on.
There's a majority of Jews that survived the war survived because they were in the partisans, or they civilians that were sheltered by local civilians. But there's this kind of funny story that I read in one of these accounts of Jewish life in Yugoslavia, and it was 1941. The Germans are in Belgrade, and they issued this racial order, and all the Jews are being rounded up and sent to the Sajmište camp. And it's this guy's account of standing on one of the main streets in Belgrade, and the Jews are being paraded down in like this labor battalion to go to the camp. And this guy turns around and he sees his Jewish friend standing next to him, and he goes, "Moishe, are you crazy? Like, you see what they're doing, the German order, like they're rounding up all the Jews. What are you doing here? Like, get out of here." And he said, "The Germans, fuck them." And then the account skips to, and in 1946, I saw him again in the same place. He had gone and joined the partisans or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it's the people, the Jews that did survive did so because, you know, they had very few options and went and joined the partisans. But that line is really great. I mean, he's like looking at these people being paraded to this camp, and he's like, "The Germans fucked them."
Yeah, that guy was he was like known for selling peanuts in the streets of Belgrade, so they would call him Peanuts Moishe. That was his nickname. Yeah. Like a working class nice. Poor person from Belgrade. I mean, the situation is totally chaotic. Also because there is like hundreds of thousands of refugees coming to this occupied Serbia, mostly from independent state of Croatia because they're massacring Serbs there, but also from other areas. In addition to that, even like 20,000 of Slovenians are sent there by Germans because from the area they annexed to the Third Reich, they, I guess, wanted to get, rid of the Slovenians, so they moved some of them to Serbia. So it's a pretty chaotic situation, and in 41, especially in Serbia, the partisan movement is on the rise, and by the end of the year, you have this huge uprising in the south of the occupied territory, in the area of the city of Užice, where the partisans basically liberated quite a big territory and proclaim it a republic, like a Soviet republic, which is, quite embarrassing and chaotic. Yeah. So the Germans and all the collaborationist forces focus on destroying it, and they managed to do that in the fall of 41. Together, I think by that time already the illegal Chetniks are starting to fight against the partisans, so they are also part of this effort, together with the Germans and all of the other collaborationist forces, the volunteers, the State Guard, and also the legal Chetniks. And they managed to destroy this partisan republic, and then the partisan movement moves out of Serbia for the time being into Bosnia mostly. So there are all kinds of atrocities. It's like committed there. It's really hard to mention all of them and what happened. It was pretty routine that these reprisals would, consist of shooting of hundreds of people and so on. The most well-known one is the massacre that happened in Kragujevac in October of 41, in 3 days, on the 19th, 20th, and 21st of October in 41, when around 3,000 people were shot by the Germans, including some 300 pupils, some of them children, as young as 8 and so on. They were killed as a response for 10 killed German soldiers and 26 who were wounded. And in all of this, the collaborationist forces assisted. Some even bragged later that they did, in the sense they were because the Germans started just because it's a large amount of people they decided they want to kill, so they just started arresting people at random. At first they arrested like the people who were non-communist, Jews and Roma, but there were not enough of them, so they just started they did that in the city of Kragujevac, but they also specifically targeted a lot of villages around it they suspected consist out of communist sympathizers. And so they arrested a lot of these people completely randomly. And then what a lot of these Ljotić volunteers did, and especially their commander Marisav Petrović, who was a commander of one of their detachments in Kragujevac, was that they were arresting other people who they thought were more suited to be shot there, and trying to exchange for some other, maybe they had some, if some patriots in their mind were arrested or something like this. So he even bragged as saying later, I was not such a bad guy, how he arrested hundreds of Roma people and gave them to Nazis in exchange for some, Serbian patriots or something like this. And they are quite obviously were saying, you see, we were like, cool. And yeah, so it was a terrible event. All of these people were killed. It didn't really help the Nazis, or especially, the collaborationist forces to be any more popular. And it was quite obvious that especially, the Ljotić people really hated by a lot of people. And you can even see that in the Chetnik. We'll have a separate episode about the so-called illegal Chetniks, because that's a whole other story, very complex. But they, for example, even though they had these connections with the Nedić regime, they really hated Ljotić and his people, and kind of were in conflict with them, and basically were proving that there's still kind of a resistance movement by fighting against Ljotić's guys, and especially because they say in their communication internal how the Ljotić volunteers are very unpopular in the Serbian people. So I think this is maybe a way for the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović to prove their resistance credentials or anti-fascist credentials, or even though they're mostly fighting against partisans and starting to collaborate with the occupiers, at least they hate these Ljotić people,
right?
At this point,
yeah.
And it's sometimes this is a really vicious conflict between them. So as I said, Ljotić volunteers enthusiastically fight against Chetniks, and in the other way as well. So the Chetniks had this system of putting people under the letter Z, which the Z stands for the Serbian word for zaklati, which means the person who should be slaughtered, like quite literally, like really like slaughtered with a knife. And these are people who they decided should be killed. And even Nedić was designated such, Ljotić of course, in some early period. And they actually, for example, they assassinated a guy called Miloš Masalović, who was the Nedić chief of his cabinet, let's say. But he was also a very important person in Ljotić movement Zbor. So a very enthusiastic Ljotić fascist follower who's super close to Milan Nedić, and one of his right hand was killed by the illegal Chetniks in 1944. So there was quite a few things like that going on there. Okay, let me see. So in addition to all of these, so I mentioned there is the Serbian State Guard, there is the Serbian Volunteer Corps, there is the Special Police, there are the legal Chetniks. There are also some other, some of these smaller formations, more weirder one we'll talk about in the next episode. But there's for example, there is a Russian Protection Corps, which is a collaborationist armed formation that in Serbia that consists out of white Russians who were living there, who came to Yugoslavia after the October Revolution. So, of course, they are enthusiastically anti-communist, and they make their own collaborationist paramilitary there, which is also part of this system. So, the occupied state or collaborationist state also develops its own ideology at the time. So, which is very informed by, the ideology of Ljotić, but not only that, you can see a lot of influences of Nikolai Velimirović that we talked about in the episode 25.
Yeah. That was the guy that didn't bathe, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The bishop of the Orthodox Church who came up with this idea of the Saint Sava nationalism and this whole ideology connected to it. So they, what they do, they talk a lot about the New Serbia. Everything is about New Serbia. So New Serbia is this basically new fascist Serbia, new National Socialist Serbia. Sometimes Nedić is even more explicitly pro-National Socialist than Ljotić is. And so it's a Serbia that has a place in the new order of Europe. And they talk a lot about Europe. Usually when they say that, they mean basically the Third Reich. So they also, they portray Nedić as a flag bearer of New Serbia and Hitler as a flag bearer of New Europe, let's say, the new order in Europe. So what they propose is to form a Serbian peasant cooperative state. So cooperative, they use the word zadruga, zadružna, which is this word that we mentioned before. It's basically a Serbo-Croatian word for zadruga, but specifically it refers to these old institutions of communal life that local people in the Balkans used also as kind of production units, and so on, which in the 19th century, some socialists were enthusiastic about. But in this fascist ideology, this is seen as a kind of a organic unit in a totalitarian state, basically. Mm-hmm. So you have an organic state. You don't have these foreign bodies, parasites, political parties, and Jews, and so on. Everyone has its own place, and a natural organic unit for it is this zadruga, or this kind of family cooperative.
Which isn't actually that different than what the Ustasha believed in as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very similar in that way.
Yeah. They are enthusiastically pro-work, and I mean, of course, discipline, order, and so on, but work is a major thing for them. So they organize something which is called the Serbian Community of Labor or Work or something like this, which is modeled after some Nazi institutions, as an institution to do some pro-work and discipline propaganda, but also they're also supposed to it's a kind of a corporatist institution that's supposed to mediate the relationships between bosses and workers and so on. But what they do also is they choose young Serbs who are special racial features and so on, and they send them delegations of them to the Third Reich for some reason, I guess, to get to know more about the new society and so on. And then they
send a bunch of young hot guys to the Nazis.
Exactly,
like an offering.
Yes. Exactly, that's what they did.
This is like
look what we have.
Myth from ancient Crete or something.
Yeah. The Ministry of Education is especially important for them. It's headed by two guys who are called Velibor Jonić and Vladimir Velmar Janković. So it's interesting. They come from the Ljotić camp of things, but they were actually in the 30s kind of his dissidents who joined Stojadinović and left his party. Because he was not cool enough for them, I guess, and was a kind of and then now they're all together. But these people are they're like fascist intellectuals who are very much into race theory, and they are the heads of the Ministry of Education. So they came up with this.
Fantastic.
The plan they have is called the 200 Great Serbian Goals or something like this to be achieved. They have a list of goals that the Serbian nation needs to achieve. So they want to...
200 is kind of a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a bit of a read.
Yeah, it's very detailed. So they want to form this, this peasant cooperative state. They want to... They use this term of living... How do you call it in English? The Nazi term of the living space?
Breathing room or some shit like that, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Lebensraum, or how was it called? They want to establish the Serbian...
living room.
Yeah. They want to establish this Serbian living room, to colonize it, to basically ethnically cleanse some populations and colonize it with Serbs who are kicked out of the independent state of Croatia. But they also want to establish a center for the research of biological and anthropological qualities of the population in Serbian lands, and a separate center which is called the Center for the Research of the Ethnographic Types of the Serbian people, and all this in order to make a racial map of Serbia.
Yeah. I'm going to give a hot take here and say that Nazi anthropology is my least favorite anthropology.
Yeah. So they are very much into that. And so also it's interesting that this, Ministry of Education thinks there are too many educated people in Serbia. So what they do is they cut the number of gymnasiums which are high schools that basically you go to in order to prepare for further education to go to the university. So they think there's too much people going to university, so they cut the number of these schools by half.
What are they, the IMF? This is
and they increase the number of more like schools that you like agricultural schools and more,
like vocational schools.
Yes, such things.
IMF.
So they're also quite openly against any children with any kind of defects in their mind going to school. So if you have like bad eyesight, you shouldn't go to school. Or if you're sick, you shouldn't go to school, especially for young girls. So it's it probably is not a shocker that this is a very patriarchal regime.
You don't say.
Yeah. So the woman has its place. They basically shouldn't work. So they should be mothers in home, and they decide that that a woman cannot have any kind of managerial place in the state at all. They can be only like an ordinary worker, like a bureaucrat. But even that they limit that they can only 25% of the workforce can be women. And especially they are discouraged to get any kind of higher education. And it's interesting because there was a lot of people who were part of this thing. So more than people know. Of course, there was a lot of who were not. But, especially among some intellectuals, middle class people, there were people who were kind of into that. So, for example, there was this kind of relatively well-known person for Serbia called Maga Magazinović, who was like she was an intellectual. She was like a first modern dancer from Serbia and theoretician of dance and so on. Is kind of seen as a feminist figure. But she was very enthusiastic about all of this during the occupation, and it was recently discovered that she wrote some text where she said how, of course, there should be like equality in the value of women in the society, but what feminism offers is like this fake equality, and feminism is basically propagated by Jewish women, something like this. And there were intellectuals who were very much a part of this new ideology. So they were also kicking out, but they were also admitting that the most of the youth is really not with them. The most of the unit are degenerates who are like into these leftist ideas, are anti-fascist and communist and so on. And this is like a horrible development that they blame the university for. But university is banned. They cannot work. They want to reopen it, but it's not allowed to work by the Germans. So they also they kick out almost 400 pupils out of high schools because of having wrong ideas, but they established this network of centers for enforced re-education, which are run by Ljotić ideologues. So these are basically fascist schools, and they said, okay, they said openly, well, maybe instead of just killing you or sending you to a concentration camp in Germany, we'll give you another chance of being re-educated as a Saint Sava kind of Serb. And they use a lot of this terminology of the Saint Sava ideology and basically want to enforce some kind of almost a theocratic system. And especially if these these young people in these centers wanted to join some of the collaborationist forces, then they could go through this system quite much faster. They were also very much against urban stuff
fucking urban stuff.
Yeah. Was it Serbian Khmer Rouge or something?
Yeah,
it's got that vibe, doesn't it?
Yeah. They were very much against
glasses,
like urban civilization, and consider it to be completely degenerate, and want to make Serbia into some kind of a peasant state. As I said, they especially hated Belgrade as a center for all this degeneracy and Jewish communist ideology, and especially against communist intellectuals. But I think most intellectuals, except those who were very much enthusiastically fascist, were suspicious of being some kind of a communist. And
if I'm not mistaken, I mean, again, I'm comparing it to the Ustashas because we'll be talking about them next week. But it seems that they have this like very peasant-oriented, anti-urban sentiment, but the majority of their base is like some sort of middle class to upper class, like intellectual.
Yeah.
I mean, right? I mean, very urban. In fact, like they don't have like a big support system in the villages at all, right?
No. I mean, the partisan movement consists out of the peasants.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Of course, it's a total contradiction. So, in addition to this, they also have some more concrete plans. So, one is by Nedić himself. They wanted to enlarge the territory of Serbia somehow. So he had this plan, which he calls Sve Serbia, like not Greater Serbia, which a lot of people wanted to call it, but he called it Sve Serbia, which means all Serbia or something like this.
All Serbia, all the time.
Yeah. So he wanted to add Montenegro to it, Dalmatia, Bosnia, parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Srem. Basically, also some parts of Belgrade, which are now given to the Ustašas. And they kind of lobbied for that for years, and they had some supporters amongst the Germans, but not in the Reich itself. Some German officers in Belgrade were supportive of some of these ideas.
They had some support with the collaborationist Bosnian Muslims too, who weren't who were anti-Ustaša, were in favor of making a deal with Serbia.
No, interesting.
Yeah.
So he managed to meet Hitler. Like Nedić met Hitler finally in like September of '43, after many years of like a few years of lobbying and so on. But he kind of chickened out in the end, and didn't even present this plan to him, because before that he met Rosenberg, and Rosenberg like shouted at him when he proposed this idea. So he didn't even propose that to Hitler.
He got scared of Daddy Hitler.
Yeah. But he did got the command, at least formally, over the Serbian collaborationist units after this meeting. So that was the result that he got, I guess. So I'll try to end this episode now slowly, going back to some of these collaborationist formations and how they ended their role in the Second World War. So the thing with the Serbian State Guard was that it was always had some connection with the Chetniks, and they were very, they were not completely trusted by Nazis, also not always by Ljotić's people. But in the end, this was an advantage because the Chetniks themselves of Draža Mihailović were collaborating more and more, especially outside of Serbia, like in areas of Dalmatia, where they were quite openly a part of the Italian occupying system. So now, through the people of the Serbian State Guard, there was a better chance of the collaborationists and the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović forces to join, because they were all losing the war, and there was a need for the nationalist forces, as they were saying it, to kind of join together against the communists. So even though in '44 the Chetniks killed like one of the Ljotić's closest people and also the right hand of Milan Nedić, as I said, his chief of cabinet, the same year in May, Ljotić finally made some kind of agreement with the forces of Draža Mihailović that they should collaborate against the partisans. So in '44, in the same year, the Serbian State Guard got a commander which was called Miodrag Damjanović, who was basically Draža's guy. So and then they changed their name to like a how would you say this in English? Srpski udarni korpus.
So the Udarnik Strike Division. There is somebody, because a lot of the partisan units had that Udarna Divizija, blah blah blah, and I think it's usually translated as like Strike Division.
Okay. So they were renamed and made it to be an official part of the Draža's Chetniks, or as they call it, the Yugoslav army in the fatherland. So this, which was like throughout the war a collaborationist unit, is now presenting itself as a part of the Yugoslav army loyal to the king in exile, which already
itself is a collaborationist unit, but not so officially. And so they move to Bosnia, like all Chetniks in 44, and together with the forces commanded by Draža, they try to attack the Bosnian city of Tuzla, who was controlled by the partisans, and they fail to conquer the city. So after that, they're kind of all over the place, very they're not motivated. And you remember, this unit was used mostly as a stationary force in Serbia. Now they're moving to Bosnia and they're supposed to attack, partisans. They're losing battles. They're, it's not a good situation for them. And Draža is really not satisfied with them. So at the same time, there is also this amnesty by the partisans. So the Chetniks are given a date until which they can join the partisans. After that, they will be considered total enemies. Before that, they have a chance. And now some of these collaborationists are actually Chetniks. So some of them decide to do that. So they desert and basically join the partisans. Smaller part of them follows the Ljotić plan and goes to Slovenia. And they are reorganized as the Šumadija division there. So also Šumadija division officially as a part of the Draža's army. Šumadija is a region of Serbia.
It's basically the region that was left in this occupied territory.
Yes.
Šumadija.
So they go to Slovenia. So I said that they followed the Ljotić plan. What was the Ljotić plan? So Ljotić had this idea, well, we're fucked. And we have to leave. So
fair enough. Yeah, I mean, they were.
So what we need to do is we should concentrate all of our nationalist forces, as he called them, in Slovenia, and mount some kind of a counter-offensive against the partisans there. Also, they are integrating at the same time at what is still considered, by themselves to be a Yugoslav royalist army. So, there will also be closer to the Western allies, who will maybe not be so enthusiastic to just kill us like the Red Army will be and the partisans. So, even in that sense, we have a greater chance there. So they start leaving Serbia on the 8th of October. They go on, the Germans supplied trains for them to go to Slovenia. Some of them are, as we mentioned earlier in the early episode, some of them are stopped by Ustašas and killed, but I think most of them manage, at least these who are going from Serbia, to go to Slovenia. Some of the Chetniks units of Draža Mihailović joined them, especially the ones who were geographically closer to that area. So the Chetniks of Vojvoda Đujić joined them there, but also others like the Momčilo, what's his name? Dobrosav Jevđević.
The Italian oriented Chetnik.
Yeah. We mentioned him. Yeah. He was close to the fascist group Orjuna in the 20s. He's now officially...
Other Chetniks called him an Italian, basically.
Yeah. He's now also officially a commander in the Chetnik movement of Draža Mihailović, but he's like a total collaborator. And most of these Chetniks of Đujić and Jevđević are basically officially integrated into the Italian occupying system, and they have this double identity of being this, Dinara division in the Chetnik movement, but also the anti-communist volunteer militia in the Italian occupying system. So they are also enthusiastic about this Ljotić plan. There are also other forces there or nearby. So there are Slovenian collaborationists there of Leon Rupnik, who Ljotić meets with and has some agreement with him. There are also Slovenian Chetniks there. There's various Russian collaborationists, including the
Cossacks and shit.
Cossacks. Also the forces of Vlasov, who was the former Red Army general who switched sides, became a pro-Nazi. So he's there. He also meets with Ljotić. And there are also
a lot of horses.
Yeah. And also the Waffen-SS units are there. Also the Italian, the Republic of Salo, like the more enthusiastically pro-Nazi Italian state in the north of Italy is close, so they collaborate with them. They have some actions against the local partisans that exist there together. But the thing is, the Red Army and the Yugoslav partisans are approaching and pretty fast there. So the Ljotić plan was that what they wanted to do
was to just bring all the fascists together so that the partisans can attack them all at once.
Yes.
Great plan.
But also to proclaim some kind of white Yugoslavia there. White meaning
they've
in
been
this
trying,
sense,
right?
yeah. Meaning like white meaning anti-communist, like in the sense it was used in the October Revolution. So all of the anti-communist forces will be there. They will swear their allegiance again to the king. And basically he thought, the Western allies, it would be too good for them to pass on such an opportunity to have, why would they want to support the fully communist Yugoslavia? We can have our own Yugoslavia, a little one there, which would be Slovenia, but Slovenia would declare itself to be a federal unit of a federal, monarchist Yugoslavia. And for now, we only have Slovenia, but we
like
basically some kind of a Taiwan kind of situation there, as a parallel like anti-communist system.
And you can see how that very well could have happened.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, he had there was some chance of happening, but the big problem was that Draža Mihailović was not into that. He had a different analysis. He was in Bosnia. He decided to remain there. So they were sending emissaries to him in order to persuade him to come, but he didn't want to do it. He had this idea that the allies will land somewhere in the Adriatic, and then he has a better chance if he stays in Bosnia. This was, of course, wrong. So, I mean, Ljotić had this idea because Draža at the time in Bosnia had about 25,000 people. And with that, and with some mobilization in Slovenia, Ljotić had an idea that they could gather like 100,000 of these like Yugoslav nationalist troops in Slovenia, plus then all the others who were there. So that was his plan. Of course, his own troops, the Serbian Volunteer Corps, were all for it. But it was interesting that on the night of November. So let me see. Okay. So a detail that shows how things developed in a very confusing way was that in September of '44. Draža Mihailović formally took the command of all of the nationalist forces. So everyone there who was part of the Ljotić plan basically said, okay, Draža Mihailović is now our commander. And this was like officially done, including the Serbian Volunteer Corps of Ljotić's most loyalist followers. But that was in September. But in November, on the night of November, Serbian Volunteer Corps was by Germans formally made to be a part of the Waffen-SS. So at the same time, they had also this double identity, like some of these Chetniks units. They were part of under one name, a part of the Chetniks, also known as the Yugoslav army in the fatherland. But on the other hand, they were finally admitted to the Waffen-SS as a Serbian kind of unit. So they in Slovenia, they gather in the little town called Ilirska Bistrica. They have all kinds of meetings there. They make plans and so on. They even start some schools for the education of the officers. Also an ideological school. And yeah, it was going on in such a way. They also managed to persuade Nazis to release Nikolai Velimirović and the Patriarch of the Serbian Orthodox Church from the Dachau prison. We talk about that in the episode 25. So they, as religious nationalist leaders, joined them there, and they blessed the troops. So yeah, it seems for a moment maybe they have some chance. But on the 23rd of April, Ljotić dies in a car crash. And really things are not going well for them. The partisan forces in the Red Army starts, it's very close and really is surrounding the whole area of Trieste there. and they're kind of signed in the state of panic. So a part of these forces, Serbian especially, goes to Austria. The other part goes to Italy. They are arrested in the Austria by the British people, and unfortunately for them, the Brits give them to the partisans. The part who went to Austria. So a lot of them were killed by the partisans in the area in Slovenia called the Kočevski Rog. So these Serbian collaborationist forces were killed there. The Ustasha forces and some others were killed in Bleiburg. So this is the big commemoration for like pro-Ustasha people today, done in Austria, in Bleiburg. But these Serbian forces were killed in another place called Kočevski Rog. But the ones who went to Italy had better luck. So they were arrested, I think, by Americans, and they were let go in 1947. And they went to the West. Also interesting, who was in Italy in 1947, Americans, why were they let go? Yeah. We always have this ghost of James Jesus Angleton there. And so they were let go in 1947. They went to the West, especially to Munich, which became a center for the Ljotić, like the Serbian Yugoslav fascist group that lived abroad. They published their newspaper there, but the Yugoslav secret and police kind of continued to make problems for them. So after Ljotić's death, his brother Jakov became the leader of the movement, but he was assassinated by the agents of the Yugoslav secret police in 1974 in Munich. Apparently strangled by his thigh while taking a bath. And so after that, they moved a bit further away. The center became Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and they're actually still there, the ones who are alive, I think, and continue to publish their little newspaper there.
Still, I mean, even. Wow.
I think now. I think it's published still. Yeah, maybe now finally someone in Serbia is doing it. But until very recently, I think Ljotić's son was the leader of the movement in Birmingham.
Wow,
crazy. Yeah. So Nedić himself was arrested, and he was. So the Western Allies arrested Nedić himself and turned him over to the Yugoslavs. And there was a trial or preparations for a trial there. And in 1946, while being interrogated by the Yugoslav army or police, I'm not sure, he jumped out of a window in Belgrade and killed himself. Today he's like revered by Serbian fascists and Nazis as some kind of a martyr who was murdered by the communists. I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
I don't understand why they make this huge deal about whether he jumped or was pushed out a window. Well, it's just like, who cares? I mean, if he jumped, wouldn't he still be a martyr, right? I mean, they love these guys who kill themselves rather than be, taken prisoner or something. Yeah. I mean, he's like a bigger victim like that, but it doesn't make any sense because, I mean, he was quite openly a collaborationist. Even the Western countries sentence their collaborationists to death and such things. So like there would be no problem for the Yugoslav government to just sentence him and kill him in a quite legitimate way, seen by everyone in the world. So I mean, there's no reason really to throw. Which is what they did to Draža, and they made a big show out of it.
I think they would probably want to do something similar to Nedić. And as I said, he seems to me as this kind of often very defeatist, kind of depressed person. So I wouldn't be surprised that he just took his chance and jumped out of a window.
Yeah. Well, what is it? A third defenestration on this arc of episodes?
Is it?
Yeah. Auto defenestration in this case.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, this story.
Sorry, just the worst enemy. The worst enemy of these people is Windows.
Yeah.
I don't know how to end anything on
it's a
collaborationists. You look, if you liked them before you heard this episode, I hope we've been able to sway your opinion.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting story because it like shows how, you have this
two different sides of collaborationism and nationalism. One was very open and enthusiastically pro-Nazi. The other started as an anti-occupation movement and then slowly, because of its anti-communism, moved into direction of more and more collaboration, and then finally merged into one thing that was simultaneously many things at once. These people said that they were members of the Allied Yugoslav army, but some of them were also officially members of the Waffen-SS, the other of the Italian anti-communist militia, and so on.
It was some kind of quantum state.
Yeah. But also it's kind of telling and interesting about, what happened after the war, which we talked about in this podcast a lot, with this fusion of Nazis and, a lot of Western forces and how they were used and so on. So, I mean, you can say that some of them were not completely wrong when they thought they had some chance.
Absolutely. System. And I mean, we'll see that later when we focus on the post-war period.
Yeah.
Further down the line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, many of them in Yugoslavia didn't have a chance, and including many of their leaders, but some did survive, and I guess they served some purpose abroad. And I guess in some of the future arcs we'll talk more about that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Ray. This was a good one.
It wasn't the funniest.
No.
Good.
But there are a lot of not funny ones in this arc.
Yeah, all the ones about
depressing,
fucking actual Nazi atrocities.
Yeah.
Hard to.
Yeah, I mean, Second World War and Holocaust is really not
hilarious. Not a hilarious time.
No.
All right. Indeed. Well, on that note,
the next episode is a bit more ridiculous.
The premium episode.
The next premium one.
Well, there you go. Yeah. So if you want that, if you want a little levity, you got to shell out the cash.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Fork it over.
Yeah.
Listener.
All right. See you guys later.
Right. Later.
Ciao.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.